blood roaring Clementine's ears as she ran, the adrenaline pumping through her veins, pushing her forward even when her legs ached in the process. She prided herself on being strong, but she was so scared. It was one thing to pretend to hold it all together, but it was another completely to lose everything at once. Who could have possibly attacked her friends? There were no signs they were being followed, or at least none that Clementine or anyone else noticed. Did Arvo return with more Russian allies? Did Mike have second thoughts and return with guns and a thirst for revenge? None of the possibilities in her mind made up any sense for her, for the scenario just came out of the blue. Their last human enemy was Arvo's group, and it felt like ages ago. She had been too comfortable, too careless and trusting. Of course, someone would be long to break the peace. Just as always, a threat would always come and destroy the shards of happiness as they left. Who could have done this? Why didn't I see it coming? She hissed to herself. She must have been louder than she intended, because Troy obviously heard and answered, "Does it really matter who or why? It could be maybe just some random group of thugs you don't know. We just gotta focus on getting there, not wondering what happened." His tone almost sounded like chastening, and she hated it. "Shut up," she snapped, moving on a bit faster away further from him. He was right, of course, but she didn't want him to admit it. It didn't take long to reach their destination, or perhaps it was long, and Clementine was too focused on running to notice. Her lungs were screaming for air by the time she stopped, the low temperatures giving her chest cold, burning sensations. "There!" Clementine cried, as she caught a glimpse of the unfinished house. The half-structure roof contrast of gray sky, and it was standing against the massive footprints littered in the snow behind them. Looking quite fresh, leading straight to the backyard area, she had realized a sick feeling that there were more two sets, meaning it could be hers and Troy's. Swallowing hard, shoving her anxiety down, Clementine made a sharp eye out for any opening to sneak through. They were in a forested area, so cover was too easy to obtain, but it would have been difficult to make it through the exposed area surrounding the house. The only hope they really had for an ambush was whoever attacked the group had moved to the front of the house, but that was probably hoping too much for her. Troy had gone silent again, and his eyes were focused ahead of them, and all the gears in his mind almost visibly turning to find an answer. For once, Clementine had found herself relying on his survival instincts, and she could only barely think through her own panic. They had came to a stop at the edge of the forest, crouching down low in the bushes, squinting. Clementine scanned their surroundings for anything that seemed threatening or familiar. With a stroke of luck, it didn't look like anyone was in the backyard of the house. Quickly exchanging a glance with Troy, Clementine opted to creep closer. Relying on the bushes as far as they stretched, they didn't thin out, however, and disappear at the next deck. Her heartbeat was so loud in her ears, Clementine almost didn't hear the hushed whisper from her companion. "Get the steps. Be quiet about it. They should be good enough to cover." With a firm nod, the girl struck out a leg carefully, stepping onto the snow and praying to God, listening to there wasn't a threat in the backyard at all. Or if they were in front, she hoped they didn't hear her. The ground crunched under her shoes as she tiptoed quietly throughout the yard, hearing the second pair of footsteps behind her. A crying sound struck from the sty, and Clementine recognized the sobs of AJ. Her heart nearly dropped to her stomach as she pushed herself forward, swallowing her worries for now. They were able to make it inside the house without any problem, given that the back of the room turned out completely empty. Clementine carefully padded into the living room, shrinking back by the stairs, and at the moment she caught a glimpse of someone through the front door. Troy caught her in the movement and copied it, pressing his back against the wall. "What did you see?" he whispered. She shook her head and placed a finger to her lips to hush him. She hadn't got a closer look, but whoever was in the front yard seemed far away enough to not have spotted her. Just in case, though, she waited a few moments before peeking her head from the staircase. Past the doorway, she could barely make out how many people there were, but squinting made her realize that no one familiar was on their feet. Once she focused on harder in the image, she could make out 3 figures standing all above a crouched group. Kenny, Jane, Sarah, Bonnie, Arvo, and Mike were all on their knees, hands tied up behind their backs and heads dropped down low. Every one of them had a different look about them. Obviously, no one was confident or happy about this predicament. The snow around them tore still up of a previous struggle. Next, Clementine squinted her eyes at those guarding like a door. Her friends, a skinny man with a beanie, an average-looking man and a woman, with his short blonde hair. 3 of them all had guns in their hands. It was so easy to tell that they weren't happy either. Dark expressions were covered in their faces, and the man with the beanie gave Arvo a little shove as he passed him. Jane and Kenny looked positively furious, flashing back equally frightening faces to the captors. Arvo and Mike looked defeated, more bruises and cuts on their faces than others. Bonnie met the eyes of their enemies, almost as if she was familiar with them. Sarah studied the ground, but didn't look as scared as she once had been. On the contrary, she just looked to be pensive, lost in her thought of another world. AJ's cries had died down to quiet sobs, echoing them through a place in the snow. Clementine breathed a little easier. At least she seemed to be frightened and not hurt. "They've been captured," Clementine replied quietly to Troy, casting her own worried gaze over them. "I can only see 3 people, but they've got guns." She wondered if there were any more enemies around. 3 people with guns shouldn't be enough to overpower for the 4 Troy and Clementine had left behind, surely. Or maybe the group was simply caught off guard. "What do they look like? Men, women, speaking English?" Troy asked. His eyes narrowed. 2 men and a woman, and they're not saying, but Arvo's tied up, so I'm assuming they probably aren't his friends. "Arvo? That kid's back?" She nodded. "Yes, and Mike too. I don't know why." Troy clenched his teeth together. "Damn it! Okay, we gotta be careful. Follow me and keep low." The one-armed man carefully clutched at his pistol, stepping forward and keeping himself as close to the floor as possible. It was sort of odd to watch. She had never considered Troy capable of a person. If anything, she had regarded him as quite weak and spineless back at Howe's, but it seemed that he knew to shape up if the situation called for it. It was almost admirable. She swallowed hard, shaking her head to clear unnecessary thoughts. Gripping her own weapon, she followed Troy to the front of the living room, where they were crouched down beside the open of the doorway. Troy moved his head to look around, and then she watched for confusion as his eyes widened and leaned back a bit. "What is it?" she asked, a disgusting feeling settling at her stomach with the strange look he had. I know them," he breathed, a jaw slack with shock. "They're guards from Howe's." Those words settled into Clementine's stomach, and her mind almost not compressing at first. She could feel her heartbeat echoing in her ears, as loud as a war eardrum. Really? She shouldn't have felt this stunned, but of course there were survivors from Howe's. But of course they wanted revenge for Carver. No one seemed to be stopped hurting his own words. The humans, taking example from the walkers, had lurking away about behind each other. And yet, perhaps it was the most terrifying truth of the situation. If they had been one of their group, Clementine knew that Kenny would have been the one seeking revenge, just as the 3 guards were. Come to think of it, Troy seemed to be sort of the captain of the dogs at Howe's. He probably knows these 3 pretty well. "What can you tell me about them?" she asked, keeping her voice low to a whisper. Troy craned his neck and peeked out in the corner of the eyes. His eyes narrowed and then squinted as he got a better look. "The guy with the beanie is Lau, and the other guy's Tyler, and the girl is Vera." Okay, the names were a good start. Lau, Tyler, and Vera. Clementine felt a little less scared, as the names added some humanity to them, at the very least. Lau is a younger than me, I think, but he's got temper. Overall, he's a kind of a chill guy. Probably smoked a lot of weed before all this. Troy then scoffed. Clementine raised an eyebrow at him, and then smirked and continued. Right. I guess you want relevant information, huh? Well, he definitely isn't the go-getter type. More of a lazy bastard, but he's always listened to me pretty good if I told him to do something. Hope fluttering Clementine's chest. You think he'll listen if you asked him to let them go? I don't know. Vera's with them too, Troy replied, shaking his head. She's got a worse temper. She doesn't hold a candle to Lau's. She's like a firecracker when she gets mad, and if she disagrees with something, she'll voice it. Bill and Tavia were the only ones she respected, but when they weren't around, she acted like she was in charge of everything. Not that I blame her. We all sort of had the power high going on. That made sense, given how mean everyone had been at Howe's. Clementine shrugged, and saying nothing, and let him continue. She'll be the most trouble, the hardest to persuade. With Tavia out of the picture, her and Lau will pretty much not be at each other's throats, since they... His voice trailed off, as if he realized who he was talking to, and just said, Never mind, grown-up stuff. You'll learn that when you're older, if you live that long. Clementine flashed him a dirty look. He had been up to bring up the kissing stuff with their friends, when they were tied up at gunpoint a few feet away. Troy continued, though unfazed. Tyler's got a good head on his shoulders and always kept out of drama. He thinks things through and things just don't jump the gun right away. More mature than the other two, that's for sure. He might be our best bet for a compromise then, Clementine mused. Troy then nodded in agreement. Could you try to talk to them? She asked, her voice shaky from betraying her calm expression. Troy then raised his hand to shush her, nodding his head towards the doorway. Let's listen for a bit. Then we'll decide what to do, he whispered. So they listened, peeking their heads through the doorway when it was convenient. And for a while no one spoke. Mike coughed at once and Sarah breathed a little heavier at times. Arvo whimpered, but no one said a word. It was like frozen in time, and all the Clementine could do was watch and wait. Eventually, though, the one Troy identified as Tyler got closer to the doorway and huffed a bit closer to the entrance, but leaned on the railing instead and sighed heavily. Finally, the silence was broken when he muttered, "This is taking longer than I thought." Those words somehow breathed life into the scene, as if they were all ready for some sign or permission to speak again. Vera ran a hand through her hair, tugging lightly at the messy blonde strands. I think these guys were good enough, but I guess we can't be too careful." Her voice was distant, lacking southern twang than both Troy and Tyler possessed in their speech. "I'm a bit worried. You never know who's lurking about these woods, besides the actual lurkers, that is." Tyler shifted his feet uncomfortably, casting a gaze over at Lau. "Any thoughts, man?" he asked. "We're just sitting in here twiddling our thumbs, Tyler," Lau barked. "Not that I'm really complaining. We've done all what we asked for do for now. Why not we just chill for a bit?" With a long sigh, Vera placed a hand over her hip. "No offense, but the minute we relax, the minute we are outnumbered by reinforcements or some shit, Tavia went looking for someone else. And yeah, but what if they're hiding in a different spot?" Next to her, Clementine saw Troy stiffen, his breath sounding caught in the throat. "Tavia's behind this, then," he muttered, barely audible with the unreadable expression. "So what? We could stake it out with our chicks in their hands, ready to fire anything that rustle a bush and accidentally kill Tavia?" Lau spat. "No offense, Vera, but that sounds like a shitty idea." Troy then couldn't help but smirk, and then his head and mumbled, "Like I said, lazy as hell." "Hey, if you want to be eaten, by all means. I'm sure the world wouldn't miss you," Vera said coldly. "Well, Vera, shut it," Tyler snapped, clearly trying to keep in peace. "I know you all have your issues with one another, but we can't let the high school drama for once. It was all cued back with Bill, and I'm sure he ain't more any charming now." Clementine exchanged glance with Troy, not missing the amused glint in her eyes. "Told you," Troy whispered with a grin. There was clearly a story that he had pointed out, but she honestly couldn't care less when their friends were in danger. Lau opened his mouth to retort something else, but just shook his head and wandered back towards the house. For a moment, Clementine stiffened, thinking that he was coming out inside, but he stopped for a moment at the porch area, peering through the surrounding woods. Though she was a bit further away, Clementine could still see Jane roll her eyes in the argument, flash a glare towards Vera, who was now standing over her nailed form. "Trouble in paradise?" Jane asked, quirking an eyebrow in amusement. Clementine was surprised that she had the guts to say that snarky being had held gunpoint. In response, Vera merely fixated on the irritated look on Jane's way and trudged past with her huff. "Listen up," she commanded, standing over before the line kneeling the prisoners. "If you were all part of the pen back at Howe's, and we won't let you forget that, your escape was clever, I'll give you that, but you violated the key rule into our community." For the first time since they returned, Clementine heard Kenny speak. His voice was low, dark, and sounded like gravel. "Did you fuckers really think we would sit there and be treated like dirt, that son of a bitch, much less by his lackeys? Yeah, you don't know how good you had it. Bill's community was just fine before you all messed it up," Lowell spat. Clementine wondered why these people would constantly chase them down, even though they thought they messed everything up. But logic didn't seem to be their strongest era, and they were just angry and vengeful. Kenny's expression turned into a worried smirk. "Wish you could have seen Carver's last moments. He didn't give two shits about any of you. He only had his interest in taunting us." "How would you know that?" Tyler asked. "He didn't beg for his life. I'll give him that, Kenny replied darkly. Gap does God us until I smash his face with a crowbar. Lau stiffened, visibly shaken by the words. You did what? He then whispered darkly, marching up to Kenny, placing the tip of his gun to the man's head. Hate to tell you, but the prize for murdering our leader is a goddamn bullet to the skull. Though Kenny didn't look scared at least, Clementine held her breath, her heart beating wildly in her chest and her legs itching forward to protect him. Stop it, Vera said. Before Clementine could move, Tavia wants them all alive for now. He killed Bill. I'm sure Tavia would understand if he ended up having an accident or something, Lau protested. But Vera and Tyler's disapproving glares were just enough to get him back off. Raising his hands in exasperation, he muttered, Fine then. Good frickin' forbid. If I try to give you this bastard at least some karma, Jesus, I'm going to see if they get any beer here. With a slight jump, Clementine realized what those words meant. He was coming inside to take a look inside, where they were currently crouching down, listening from her. Her mind spun as she tried to figure out a good hiding spot, falling onto her backside in the process. But Troy had other plans. Troy just stood up, catching Lau's gaze at the moment as the man got closer to the doorway. She didn't even have time to crawl away as the guard caught her off quickly. His eyes widened. Troy? He squawked, alerting the other two immediately. What? Wait, what? Did you just say? Tyler had stammered, hustling inside the house. He cast a glance down at her and then at Troy, and then outside and back at Troy. You aren't dead? His voice was even quiet in disbelief, his own words bulging out, like it hadn't been a ghost. Based on his own words, though, maybe he did and maybe he was looking at one. Troy didn't look frightened or intimidated, at least. He quirked a brow and retorted, Do I look frickin' dead, Tyler? I would have thought you would have told the difference between the lurkers and the people, but maybe not. Tyler froze, lowering his gaze to study the wooden floor, like it had been the most interesting thing in the world. Swallowing hard, he mumbled, I didn't mean it like that, and you knew it. Then, how did you mean it? Lau stepped up next. His eyes was almost at level with Troy's. We thought you died in the herd, man, when we saw you disappear into it, and you never came back. Whatever was left of you, I mean, we didn't even want to look for. There was almost a sadness in his eyes, as if Troy disappearing had bothered them. Well, I ain't dead, as you could see. What happened to your arm? Vera asked, still outside but focusing her attention towards him. She looked a little bit hesitant. Not for the confident one, as before, that's for sure. With a scowl, Troy replied, I was getting to that. Jesus, some lurker decided to chomp off on my wrist like that, like I was an evening snack. And I figured I was already dead, but this kid here, he nodded towards Clementine, cut off my arm and well, here I am. Howell's jaw dropped. Whoa, so it was like Reggie, huh? I still can't believe chopping that off worked. You and me both. Giving listless shrug, Troy stepped closer to Lau. But tell me, why did you all follow us all the way here, huh? It was very subtle, but Clementine was looking at Vera when Troy spoke to Lau, and she caught it in the way of the woman's eyes narrowed towards the word us. Vera took us 2 steps closer to the doorway and called in. Come outside, Troy, and we can talk. Bring that little girl with you. Clementine shrunk down, feeling her skin crawl at the words. Troy seemed relaxed and around these guards, but she sure as hell wasn't as far as she was concerned. They were just much of a kind of a threat as anyone else that they encountered. Fine, whatever. Come on, Troy mumbled, ushering Clementine outside. She opened her mouth to argue, but she realized it would be pointless. She had already been spotted after all, and it wasn't exactly who she knew where she could hide. Reluctantly, she followed Troy, Tyler, and Lau outside, gaze locking with Sarah once she got within sight. Clem! Her voice cried, visibly sighting, and brightening. I knew you'd come back. Once she stopped in the snow outside, Clementine nodded towards Sarah, sweeping her gaze over the rest of her friends. Kenny also appeared overjoyed to see her. Jane, Bonnie, and Bonnie looked relieved, but Arvo and Mike refused to meet her eyes. Vera trudged up to her mouth, pressed onto the firm line as she stared down at her. On her knees, kid, she muttered, the tip of her gun pointed at the Clementine's direction. Swallowed hard, the girl tried not to argue, and she knew that moment she would grab for her own pistol, and the guards would only shoot her if she were under their orders to keep them alive. There would be no hesitation still to hurt her. These people weren't messing around. Tyler was at least gentle when she tied her arms behind her back. She knelt down next to Sarah, flashing her friend's confident smile as she could muster. I was worried, Sarah replied, glancing towards the guards. I was too, Clementine replied softly. About all of you. Troy's voice was cut off by any reply Sarah might have had. Hey, come on now, there's ain't time for that, he tried to argue, nodding his head pointlessly towards Clementine, but Vera merely turned her gun to him next, causing his eyes to widen in surprise. Don't make this difficult, she muttered. As far as I'm concerned, you're with them now, Troy. Get on your knees, too. Lau flashed an ridiculous look. Are you serious? It's Troy. You remember him. Vera crossed her arms, huffling. It's not like I like doing this, but he can't be trusted now. Once Tavia comes back, we could talk to her about it. Sorry, Troy. She cast a reluctant glance over him, the offered tone in her voice absent. With a glare, Troy replied, That best you could say? Sorry? You better pray Tavia comes back quickly. And how the hell do you think you're going to tie me up? I only got one freaking arm. Just tie his feet together, Vera suggested, ignoring the old co-worker's anger. You sure about this? Tyler asked, clearly hesitating, but his companion nodded, and the man added a quiet apology to his own Troy, he gently lowering him to his knees and tying him at the legs. Get their guns if they have any, Vera said, and Lau moved this time. He knelt down in front of Clementine, gently taking the gun from her belt loop. Any other weapons, kid? Lau asked. She shook her head. That was enough for him, and he moved on and did the same for his former comrade. Troy curled up his lips into a snarl after his gun was taken. His expression was looking as if though he was trying to burn a hole into the guards, just using the eyes. Clementine couldn't even find his frustration funny, as he was in the hope of talking down to the strangers. Vera walked in front of all of them like a stereotypical army sergeant, taking a look at all the prisoners and nodding in confirmation with each one. All right, now the things seem settled here. I need to radio Tavia. Once she hears we found the straggler from the group, and a surprise, I'm sure she'll return quickly. Tyler, watch the backyard, and Lau, you stay here. I'll be right back. Without giving her partners any chances to argue, she stormed off, walking off a few yards away from the snow, thankfully out of earshot. Tyler decided to listen to Vera's instructions, but Lau just shrugged and muttered, Fuck this, I'm getting a beer, and then walked inside the house. Finally, this gave Clementine a chance to check on her friends. Is everyone okay? I mean, no one's seriously hurt, right? She looked to everyone in confirmation. At least she was able to see that no one looked too physically injured. They all nodded their heads anyway, bringing some relief to the stressful situation. I'm just glad you're all right, Clem, Kenny whispered, flashing a smile at her away. She gave a grin in her own in return, happy that Kenny hadn't provoked the guards too far to get himself killed. Come on, Clem, Sarah whispered. I just thought about shooting my own gun when they first ambushed us. When that opportunity came, I couldn't do it. I'm sorry. With a shake of her head, Clementine replied, It's okay. It might have not been the best thing to do anyways, despite what Troy in particular thinks. Shooting first and asking questions later isn't always the best strategy. She could feel Troy setting a glare in her way, but just to continue to focus on Sarah. The older girl shrugged, a small smile crossing her lips. Thank you, Clem. Clementine couldn't help but grin back, realizing just how mature her friend had become. It wasn't a giant leap in the personality or anything, but it was something that told her that Sarah would have been cowering in fear for weeks now, and she seemed to almost calm and reserved during his crisis, as if though her life wasn't in district danger. It was refreshing to see any process, so especially so in Sarah's survival skills. But those thoughts of pride were then put on hold for now. Clementine couldn't help being quiet any longer. Oh, okay. I don't really understand what happened here, she muttered, shaking her head. How did they find us? Mike let out a heavy sigh. It's my fault. My fault. I'm so sorry. This isn't what I wanted. Sarah then flashed Mike a sympathetic glance before returning to Clementine. Mike and Arvo said to the guards caught on to them on their way out from here. Yes, they beat us too, Arvo whimpered. Mike nodded in agreement, his bruised face wilting with sadness. Listen, we didn't want any trouble when we left. We were just gonna do and go out of your lives, and then they forced us back here. They had no idea who Arvo was, but they recognized me. They assumed the others were nearby. Didn't get very far before captured, Arvo added quietly. With a heavy sigh, Mike turned back to look at the group. The remorse in his eyes was so clear, it hurt to see him like that. I'm so sorry. I wouldn't want any of you to get hurt because of me. They were going to kill us if we didn't lead them back. It would have been what you deserved, Kenny growled, but Clementine shot him a glare. The short of time away from him was probably best for her, and as she gained a little bit more confidence to speak in her mind. That isn't what we need right now. It's the fighting that's going to get our group split and dwindle in the first place, she snapped, dwindling a bit into her ropes. Please stop arguing. Kenny's eyes widened a bit at a response, but ultimately gave a nod. Clem's right. I call a temporary truce until we get out of this mess. How heroic of you, Jane retorted under her breath. Clementine ignored her and then smiled back at Kenny, grateful that he was able to agree to reason. Arguing in the middle of the hostage situation would only make things worse, and possibly would get them killed. Speaking of danger, is AJ okay? He's in that box, right? Clementine asked, nodding towards it in the snow just a few feet away. She couldn't quite seem to see it, but it did catch a glimpse of a few blankets. At least the guards weren't so cruel to let the infant freeze to death. The very thought of that where it could be people like that nowadays always chilled Clementine to the bone. She took her head clear out of thought, catching Kenny with a nod. He's fine. They just brought the box outside with everyone else. I think the girl put some more blankets on top of him. His eyes flickered to Vera, adding quietly, motherly instinct probably. Wouldn't probably pass these guys to be shitheads though. That made sense. It helped soothe Clementine's fears that they were just waiting to be executed like animals, despite what Tavia apparently ordered before she left. At least AJ was safe. If nothing else, that was comforting though. Thank God, she muttered, sighing in relief. Not to change the subject, but did you end up finding, Bonnie whispered, eyeing the house to indicate. Clementine assumed the truck behind it. With a nod, the young girl squirmed a bit in the ropeskin. It's in my pocket, don't worry. Lau hadn't searched their pockets, so he hadn't found the jumper cable stuffed anyway. If nothing else, at least she could do was comfort the fact that she was still holding onto what was left in the first place for her. Bonnie, Troy hissed, more agitated than before. Didn't you try and talk to those idiots? The redhead nodded. I did try, Troy, I swear. They didn't listen to me. Thought I was a traitor for leaving with everyone. He scowled in response. I heard them saying Tavia brought them here. Did you see her? Was there anyone else with her? She was with them at first, yeah, and helped ambush to tie us up. Then she left a scout for the area nearby, then a walkie-talkie from House with her. Biting her lip, Bonnie added quietly. She was alone when she left. I don't think anyone else from House survived. Troy's face lit up with a surprise at the moment, before he masked with anger again. Well, damn, still ain't bad odds, I guess. Lau then returned with the beer in hand, chugging the liquid quickly, presumably before Vera returned. He scrunched up and threw it onto the ground, and littering what was left of their worries now. Clementine couldn't help but flash a sour look in his way. He didn't notice her, and just approached Tyler, muttering something to the other man. A few moments later, Vera rejoined the other guards, adding their conversation. Clementine couldn't hear exactly what they were saying, but the name Tavia did come up in just a few times. The silence fell while strangling, and Clementine could feel the weight of the situation in the air. The guards chatted amongst themselves away from them, but no one else would find the words. Maybe they were all trying to figure out some way to overpower their captors and escape, but it all felt like futile. The minutes dragged on, and she studied on the snow below her as if the most interesting thing in the world. I'll be damned. Finally, a distant voice broke through the quiet, and a familiar figure appeared from the door of the house, a rifle tightly clutched in both hands. Tavia marched down to the front of the porch steps, slowly stepping up towards the group. Her expression was tightened, and lips pursed lightly together, and her eyebrows frowned. Clementine watched her, holding her breath, as the woman dragged a sharp gaze across her friends, until a set of dark brown eyes finally settled on her. The girl's heart pounded in her chest, the feeling as if though it could break a rib cage at any moment. Tavia had nothing to say to them yet. Instead, she turned to the guards and said, You weren't kidding, Vera. I can't believe Troy survived. One arm down, but still kicking. It's incredible. Vera, Lau, and Tyler lined up next to her immediately. Their stances were straightening respectively. Vera was the first one to speak, her tone much less assertive than before. Troy wasn't even kidding when he had said she grew quieter every moment the authority came around. Tavia, ma'am, as I told you on the radio, we found him and the girl coming back for the house. I don't know what they were doing, but they were returning from somewhere, and we caught them, Vera explained. I see. With a thoughtful nod, Tavia decided not to press the issue or ask for any further details yet. Instead, she asked, any word on the missing ones? Luke, Nick, Carlos, Rebecca, the Indian woman? Kenny clenched his teeth tightly, growling, her name was Sharita. And we told you, they're all dead, Jane scoffed. All of them, huh? You somehow lost 5 members of your group in a week or so, Lau questioned, quirking her brow. Sarah spoke next, surprising Clementine with a clear voice. We can't exactly believe it either, but it's the truth. My dad, and as everyone else you mentioned, is gone. She was biting her lip, tears pooling under her eyes, but as she seemed adamant to not shed them. Tavia was unmoved. Is that so? Luckily, Rebecca had her baby. He turned out to be quite cute, isn't he? She then flashed a quick smile towards the box holding AJ. Kenny clenched his teeth together. If you as so much so as touch a hair on his head. With a roll of her eyes, Tavia shifted her weight onto her foot, giving her a stance with a casual look. You're serious, aren't you? You think I'll hurt an infant? Christ, I'm not that heartless. You haven't exactly given us the reason to believe you, Jane snarled. I guess I haven't yet. Well, in this case, we'll be taking you back to Howe's, Tavia announced, as if it hadn't been completely obvious. Why? Mike dared to ask. That shithole can't be in one place. Why would you even bother it? Giving a glare, Tavia slowly walked up to them, her gaze piercing through as she looked down. Without a warning, the butt of her gun struck Mike in the cheek, almost knocking him over. As he gasped in surprise and pain, Tavia sneered. I don't think you understand the severity of what you all did, so let me explain to you. Bill is dead and House is in shambles. Most of my guards are dead. Our community is dead. But there was a pause. Everyone held their breaths until she continued, suddenly wary of how lower her gun could be used if spoke out for any of them. But Bill always did preach of communities that can be rebuilt. Time and time again, we lose members. We gain them. Ask Troy and Bonnie. They'll tell you. We've had a lot of people come in and some die off, but there's always more room for improvement. Always room to start again. Tavia explained, a wicked grin on her face. That's where you all come in. Clementine could almost feel her heart leap into her throat, and her nerves all standing around like ends like she'd been re-electrocuted. The look on Tavia's face was downright terrifying. She truly meant every word she was saying. And what if we refuse to take part in this? Jane asked, his expression on her face growing dark. Tavia just continued, Oh, I assure you, you don't get a choice here. We'll be taking you back in trucks. They're parked nearby in the forest. We brought 2 of them before with us, and you'll see. You'll be going in one for cargo. She paused for a moment before bouncing out from the prisoners and bobbing her head as if she was counting to herself. Here's 7 of you now, including the child, she reported. I can expect there to be 7 when we return, but I can't be held responsible if you mess up and lower that number, can I? Bonnie quickly whipped her head around to the others, doing the same mental math in her head, turning back to Tavia. Tavia, there's 9 of us, she pointed out, her tone wary and cautious. Clementine stood her anxiety. If Tavia meant they were going to start with 7, then what did they meant to do with 2 extras? 9 of them, the baby included, Lau agreed, scratching his chin. Will they all fit? Do we need some off of them? The casual way he said those words made Clementine squirm a bit. As she lowered her head, the ground grew shaky as her vision blurred. Sarah seemed to be equally frightened, as if though she showed it less in the posture than more in the eyes. She scooted herself slightly, at the movement slow and enough to not be noticed. The 2 girls pressed briefly against each other, and Clementine couldn't deny the fact that it was a bit more comforting to see her best friend to be near them right now. Tavia interrupted. The nice moment, though, with a cold, cutting tone. No, Lau, that is not what I had in mind, she said, set her eyes on Bonnie. The redhead swallowed hard, looking very much like she would be rather anywhere else in the world in the moment. But Tavia just regarded her casually, just lowering her head, and she spoke. Simply put, Troy and Bonnie, I'm offering you back your old jobs. The words were so heavy that no one responded before she continued. Return with us, and you'll given the chance to be guards again, and I'll have to demote you for just a few weeks, or even days, depending on your behavior, just to make sure you're still trustworthy. I still need loyal guards more now than ever, and finding you two alive should be a blessing. Troy's mouth hung open. Are you kidding me? He stammered quietly, expression unreadable. Why would you want us back? Bonnie asked in suspicion, lacing her tone. I believe she just explained that. Maybe just listen next time? Vera snarked. Shaking her head, Bonnie continued. No, I heard her. I just don't understand why. Why would you consider such a thing? Especially when back at least I willingly left the hellhole. You must be desperate, Mike mumbled from beside her. Maybe. Or you didn't know I went by my own accord? Bonnie guessed. Tavia only sneered, shaking her head. Oh, please. I know what happened to you. Just because we lost sight of Troy and the herd doesn't mean we weren't clearly walking with the pen prisoners. On those words couldn't exactly spell out the good intentions to me, Jane pointed out. Tavia sighed and waved a hand in exasperation. Says the girl we found poking around outside with the smeared shit all over her face. She then shook her head, dropping the conversation. Look, just think about it for a moment. I'm offering you something great, and asking for a little something in return for it. I doubt things will go back to normal, even with the guards. There's no way, Tavia. For all the people we let Carva's utopia change in major ways. Mike spat. With the shake of her head, Tavia then replied, just because I want to keep many things as rules doesn't mean I want to add my own flair to them. And a flair I think you'll find much more effective. If you gave the chance to change. She then smiled, turning to her former guard. Besides, Bonnie, don't pretend I don't know you. Excuse me? Bonnie asked, tilting her head a tiny bit. When we picked you up with Vince and them, I could tell you what kind of life you had before all this. I know you're not a bad person, Bonnie, even if you had some less favorable habits in the past. The remark seemed to really anger Bonnie, and the narrowed eyes so fiercely, Clementine could swear she saw daggers reflecting back, pretty much back at them. Fuck you, she growled angrily.